And after this coup, they sent me home, and I walked into the trailer, and my dad sort of dusted his hands off and said, "Well, kiddo, I guess you're not going to be good at school." And I was only 4. But he made this sort of what he called a vision, which was his word for a vision. And he said, "I might as well train you up hustling." And so he gave me a razor blade and a 2-inch folding knife and coated my arms with Vaseline. And that's a sort of a fight tactic, and said, "I'm going to raise you to be a drug trafficker."
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you're new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Sarah Billups, Sarah Bessie, and Micah Boyette. You can go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Dana Trent. Dana Trent is a speaker, professor, award-winning spirituality author, and minister. A graduate of Duke Divinity School, she teaches world religions and critical thinking at Wake Technical Community College in Raleigh, North Carolina. I can't imagine coming home from preschool and being christened into the drug trafficking business by your father. But Dana Trent can, because that's exactly what happened to her. In this conversation, Dana and I discuss her story growing up with 2 mentally unwell parents, as told through her excellent memoir, Between Two Trailers. Dana shares experiences with childhood trauma, identity formation, and spiritual practices that have aided in her healing as an adult. We discuss the role of Christian community in supporting mental health through practices like active listening, vulnerability, and meeting basic needs. And she emphasizes developing empathy for those struggling and also using churches as hubs for open conversations and small groups. It's a fantastic conversation that dives deep into trauma, identity, and healing. So join us as we find our way out of adverse childhood experiences into a life of meaning and belonging. Here is my conversation with Dana Trent. Dana, welcome to Shifty Culture. Really excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Joshua, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
This is a fantastic book, Between Two Trailers, sharing your story growing up in Indiana and North Carolina, between 2 trailers and between 2 parents, and dealing with really the trauma of your childhood. Can you just take us into your story so we could situate ourselves and know what we are talking about?
Absolutely. So I was born to 2 parents who were mentally unwell. My father was a diagnosed schizophrenic, and my mother had several personality disorders. My parents met in a locked psychiatric facility in Cincinnati in late 1977, and their match was sort of doomed from the start, right? It was one of those things that started with madness and it ended in madness. But we landed after I was born in a trailer in Western Indiana. And because my parents were mentally unwell, they couldn't hold down jobs and they were struggling to make ends meet. And so they began a drug trafficking business out of that trailer in Indiana. And so I grew up in that environment, both in the environment of like mental illness, but also the environment of an illicit business that was, Joshua, quite frankly, run like a religion. We were a very faithful household, but we were engaged in this illegal business that was just wild from the start.
And so then how did they draw you into that business? How did they draw you into the madness of their lives?
Yes. So when I was 4 years old, I was expelled from preschool for leading a nap time coup to The Heat Is On from Beverly Hills Cop, which was my favorite song at the time. And after this coup, they sent me home and I walked into the trailer and my dad sort of dusted his hands off and said, "Well, kiddo, I guess you're not going to be good at school." And I was only four. But he made this sort of what he called a vision, which was his word for a vision. And he said, I might as well train you up hustling. And so he gave me a razor blade and a 2-inch folding knife and coated my arms with Vaseline. And that's a sort of a fight tactic, and said, I'm going to raise you to be a drug trafficker. And so that's how it began at 4 years old. And then he gave me the street name Budgie, which is a parakeet. So when he named me Budgie, he sealed it in, my street name, with a Vaseline cross to my forehead. So I was christened as his lookout for this drug trafficking business.
Wow, at 4 years old.
Yeah.
And looking back, as you're starting to reckon with your childhood and your life, what did that do to you as
Ooh.
you are christened into this drug trafficking life, being the lookout, Kristen, with Vaseline on your forehead? Looking back, what did that start to do to you?
Well, this is going to sound odd, but it actually gave me a craving and a sense for belonging and community, right? It was in and of itself a faith construct. It was a religious construct for us, this business. And then from that moment on, I sort of developed this identity, this sort of classic, if we're looking at Christian theology and Enneagram studies, this sort of classic helper identity of wanting to do right by my parents and wanting to be the best little lookout I could possibly be at age 4. And so I felt a part of things. I felt in community, even though I didn't understand that obviously this is very traumatic and dangerous. And so my go-to sort of motivation was being the best possible lookout I could be at age 4.
Well, I mean, I think that's what we're all yearning for as
Right.
children, right? Is a sense of
Yes.
belonging, a sense to where do we fit in? How do we relate to home? How do we
Right.
relate to our family, other people? This is a sense of belonging. This is who we're looking for. What does that do? And then how does your mother play into this? And
Mm.
what was the difference between your schizophrenic father, who was pretty out there and all over the
Yes.
place, and then your mother with personality disorders and other things? What was the contrast between the two?
Yeah, you could always look at my father and tell how loud the carnival barkers in his head were. He had very outward facing, very loud symptoms of his schizophrenia, and he wore different outfits to denote his personalities. And so you knew which personality or persona you were coping with, that you were interfacing with based on what he was wearing. But my mother was completely different. You know, while he was raised as a gritty Midwesterner in Indiana, she was raised as a polite Southern debutante in Central North Carolina. And so while his hallucinations and psychoses were outward facing, her depression and anxiety was like turned inward. And so she spent months in bed, months and months and months. So when we were living in that trailer, if you can visualize it, you're in a single wide that looks like a shotgun house, which means that if, somebody spends like a 12 gauge buckshot, you're done, right? It's dominoes. So she's in the back bedroom, lying in bed all day, guarding these floor to ceiling stacks of drugs and watching the 700 Club, right? And watching Tammy Faye and crying with Tammy Faye. And then he's in the kitchen, sort of casting these visions, my father, whom we called King. And so I'm running the length of the trailer back and forth to attend to both of them, the king out front and the lady in the back, and Budgie in the middle, between two parents, between two trailers, right? Trying to figure out where my place is, even in this little micro edition of community in this trailer in Indiana.
And so you're like a little ping pong ball, and
Yes.
your parents are trying to make you into something that they need for their coping to live, right?
Exactly.
What does that feel like as a child of when they're trying to say, you are the thing that I'm getting my life from, and I need you to be really my savior in this situation?
You feel responsible. Very responsible. From a young age, I was sort of trained to anticipate needs and to meet needs. And my mother's favorite thing to say to me was, make yourself useful, young lady. So that sort of ingrains in you this deep need, at least it did for me. And Joshua, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, sort of this early childhood development need that manifests later as our coping and our personalities, the need to be needed and the need to be useful and meet other people's needs. Therefore, in my identity, I never sort of had that natural childhood development of finding your own self, right? It was always being a midfielder between the two of them. And so, yeah, and I'd love to hear your perspective on that, like how those early moments shape us in our faith and in our ministry and just who we are in general.
I think that's the work of our adult lives, is to
Yeah.
detangle ourselves from the pain of our childhood, where we have created unhelpful and unhealthy coping mechanisms to say that I find my identity in, people pleasing or whatever it was for you. Where does your identity lie? So as a believer, as one that is made in the image of God, as an adult, I had to shift my identity to say I'm a beloved child of God. And that's where I found my rootedness and my life. And out of that, then I can do all of my other ministry and work and faith and life with family. But if I don't get to that spot, your identity is going to be shaped in all sorts of different crazy ways. And
Right.
it's different for everybody because we all have different wounds
Yes.
as in childhood.
Right.
And, I was just talking to interviewing somebody yesterday, and she was talking about the difference between, she said all trauma is basically, wounds from your childhood. So we all have wounds.
Yeah.
I think some people, when they hear the word trauma, they go, okay, why are we moving into this medical sense when you're talking about faith? But people are okay with talking about wounds. So the wounds of your childhood is the thing that we need to be healed from so we can find our identity in something else. And I think that you are starting to walk through that and wrestle with it and walking through this. So for you now as an adult, as you're looking back on your life, how did writing your story start to help heal that trauma and those wounds to help you find your place of home and your new identity of who you are as Dana and not who you are in relation to others?
That's so, what you said earlier is so well said. This idea that identity can be rooted in something that transcends us, right? And then when we do that, that is very grounding. And then going back to like trauma and wounds, there were two things that come to mind. The first thing is we had many household rules, right? Like I said, running an illicit business was very much like a religion. We had rituals, smearing Vaseline. We had rules like don't commit 2 crimes at once, which is a great rule. And then the biggest rule, though, was don't write anything down. So look at me, right? Here I am, a writer. And to paraphrase Joan Didion, like I write to figure things out. That's how I think. I don't know how to think any other way. And so for me, this book is a long extension of figuring out my life between two trailers, between two parents, right? In this faith construct, very faithful parents, yet didn't have any sort of moral objection to running this illegal business. And so I had to sit down and write and process that. And like Didion, I can't think, I can't feel without writing and going through it. It's almost like a spiritual practice for me. I equate it like writing as a prayer, journaling is a prayer for me. And so getting this book down was breaking that rule. Don't write anything down. Here I am breaking the rule, and I'm not a rule breaker. And so, but for me, that's where, going back to those wounds that you were just talking about, I had to return to the war, right? I had to return to the battlefield in order to heal and scar over those deep wounds. And the way I did it was through writing. Something that worked for me was writing it down.
I want to get back into that, and then our role as a community around people that are dealing with trauma or like mental health issues, and how we do that. But I'd love to just dive into your story a little bit before we do that, and go as your mother then uprooted you from Indiana and took you to North Carolina. What was, as you started to live into the reality that, hey, we're leaving Indiana, we're leaving my father, and we're going towards a new place in North Carolina. What was that sensation like? What was that feeling like? Take us into that moment for you.
That summer day, I was, 6 years old, and I can still see my parents out in the gravel driveway in front of that trailer. And my mother had packed the silverware, which I thought was so strange, right? I can see her putting it in the trunk. And I don't think she thought that we were going to leave, but it was so abrupt. I never got to say goodbye to that trailer, to my room, to my life there. And as soon as we got to Indiana, it was like we were making a fresh start. And my parents were the type of folks who got wild hairs of ideas and burned bridges without thinking about it, And so I think for my mother, it ended up being a fresh start, but it also meant a do-over, a mulligan, right? And a mulligan for her to recreate my identity. And so because I was such a helper and a people pleaser, I gravitated to whomever I was with and whatever they wanted me to be. And so for my mother, she wanted a polite, saccharine, Southern, Revy was her nickname for me, Revy, short for Reverend. So I went from budgie, gritty Midwestern preschooler, drug dealer lookout to Revy, sort of a Carolina chaplain for my mother. And so when we made that transition from Indiana to North Carolina, the pivot was so strong that it was like everything related to Indiana had to be expunged from my record. If I started to have an Indiana accent, she quickly corrected it. She changed the way I dressed. She changed my hair. She gave me a perm so I'd have curly hair instead of straight, sort of a bowl cut. So everything about my identity was shifted, and everything began to revolve around her. And her motto in those days, for the Carolina days, was, "Dana, the world owes you nothing. You owe the world everything." And by world, the lady, my mother, really meant her. Yes, that she had plucked me and saved me from this Indiana environment. And therefore, because she was my new savior, I was to bow and genuflect and worship her and do whatever she needed. So that was the new identity cast at age 6.
So that identity was cast at 6. You literally became a Carolina chaplain.
Yeah, literally.
She gave that to you at 6. How now in your life, as you became a Carolina chaplain and you started to live into the identity that your mother gave you at 6, how have you started to detangle yourself and your identity from what she has given you or what you were trying to do for her and into who you are as a person now?
Oh, yes. Well, right now, today, it's about integration, right? That detangling for me is integration, because I lost a huge part of myself. I lost my Indiana family. I lost my father. I lost my name, literally. Trent is not my birth name, right? So we even changed my name. And so to sort of expunge completely. And so what I had to do today was, as soon as both of my parents had passed away, which for me was 2017, I was 36 at the time, then I had to figure out who I am, right? Because these two anchors of my life, these two very different people who are very unwell, have disappeared. And I'm essentially an adult orphan, which happens to all of us, right? And we've never lived in the world without our parents. So when they pass away, it affords us in many ways a different kind of relationship to them and to ourselves that isn't available when our parents are living. And so that's when I began to excavate and detangle the threads of my Indiana life in order to merge these very two different daughters together of Budgie and Revy to figure out that I am the alchemy of those two identities, right? I've got traits from both parents. I've got the history, the stories, the narratives, and I am the amalgamation of both. But it's taken decades of therapy and decades of writing to get there, and you said so eloquently that adulting is about that detangling process, right? And I think sometimes we have very specific tools that we can be successful in that untangling. And then sometimes we have old tools that no longer work for us. And so I'm obsessed with learning about tools that work and knowing what doesn't work as well. So for me, that's what that looks like today. It's a daily practice of integrating those two very disparate identities so that I can continue to heal from the trauma.
Yeah. So then what are some of these practices that help you heal and work for you in dealing with your trauma?
Awesome. So what has worked for me is writing, for sure. Writing to think, to figure out. What also works for me are deep-seated spiritual practices that calm my central nervous system. So in Christianity, that might look like breath prayer using Job 33, verse 4. Inhale, the Spirit of God is within me. Exhale, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. So breath prayer, centering prayer, lectio divina, meditation, movement, exercise. I'm a group fitness instructor now. Movement works, anything that's centered in my body, because trauma lives in the body. And so, Joshua, I'm so curious too, as you talk to all of these people from different experiences, what do you find works for them and for you, specifically these tools?
I just heard that there's a song. Have you heard the Porter's Gate song by Andrew Peterson called Centering Prayer?
No.
You should look that up. That's a great for centering prayer. As he sings, like, my feet, I'm here. It centers you. It's really good. So you should look that up as a centering prayer and to help people. And I think all of those, any of these spiritual practices are going to help. And there are a myriad of them, right? And so I would say connect with spiritual director, connect with somebody, do that, and in your community to figure out what are some of these practices. I know that Lectio 365, which is a 24/7 prayer app that they go through daily prayers, is really helpful. I mean, my wife and I do that every day, and then we have noonday prayers that we pray, and then the examine at the end of the day to figure out where was God in the midst of our day and our practice. And those prayer centering type things are really helpful. For me, when I feel closest to God is in the midst of creation, as the earth. It's just being in nature with Him. I'd like to say that, one of my big spiritual practices is I go on walks with Jesus. And so just walking with Him. And I think it's different. I go on walks without Jesus sometimes. I mean, He's always there, but I go on walks listening to podcasts or music or something. But then sometimes I will take those out and say, I'm just going to be present. Then, that centering prayer is really helpful for me, where I just sit quiet and listen and know that the presence of God is with me. I think so. We all have these different practices. I think when you grow into a space, I would assume, my wife had a bipolar father. And so when he was manic, there was craziness and they got to live in a small trailer for a while in Fort Mill, South Carolina,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
right outside of Charlotte. But as they were living in those things and he was going manic, she had to try and control, what she was able to control. So she was making sure that her little world, whatever it was orderly, and still had that. What does that look like for you now that, you had like a proper, like, my mother wants me to be orderly and proper. Your father was a little, crazy. And so
Right.
how did you, in the midst of that, what are some of the things as a child walking through those things did you wrestle with and try to take care of yourself in the middle of it?
That's a great question. And just going back to spiritual practices, I love that you and your wife have like an anchoring morning, noon, and evening examine. Like that's incredible to me because it anchors the day, the entire day. And then walking with Jesus, he walks with me and talks with me along life's merry way. That's the hymn that came to my mind when you said that. Um, so those are amazing practices. Those are healthy practices, right? So now I'd like to shift when in this answer and give you some of the unhealthy ways that I began coping as a child because they were unhealthy and they manifest here today for sure. So control, right? As a child, I began when my mother would take me to the waiting rooms of psychiatrists to sort of figure me out, right? She was worried that I would turn out like my father. And the psychiatrists were like, no, this youngster is fine. She's got PTSD. She's going to be fine. But in the waiting rooms, instead of playing with the toys that were out for children, I would stack the magazines very neatly and get to cleaning the waiting room and straightening up and fluffing pillows, whatever I needed to do to control the environment. And so at a young age, I developed this maladaptive coping mechanism of cleaning, like obsessively cleaning and straightening that still is with me today. And the other one that's maladaptive that I think a lot of kids have is what's called body focused repetitive behaviors. I'm touching my head right now. For those who can't see it who are listening. So body focused repetitive behaviors are any kind of behavior that involves your body, like skin picking or hair twisting or picking at your cuticle beds, anything like that. And a lot of children develop that as a way of, again, controlling, centering themselves in their body, right? Just to kind of ease that disassociation behavior that where you like go inside internal when there's chaos around you. And so those two things are something that has stayed with me, the cleaning and the body focus repetitive behavior. And the third maladaptive coping mechanism that I developed in childhood is a food addiction. And so we were food insecure, right? I ate ketchup sandwiches and drank from a tall can of Hawaiian punch, right? That was my diet as a kiddo. And so when food was accessible, oh my goodness, I still have a really hard time with buffets, right? Because I want to like open up my purse and shove all the rolls in my purse like Sophia Petrilla from the Golden Girls. So those are the ways, Joshua, to answer your question, that I began to control myself and my environment. The compulsive cleaning, the hair pulling in my case, and then the food addiction, overeating.
So now let's look at our community. And so even think of any Christian community. How could we start to see people that are mentally unwell? And how can we be something that can be rooted, grounded places for people that are mentally unwell? And a lot of times we don't. We just see the effects of what's happening on the inside, right? So we go, oh, they're crazy drug dealers. I don't want to deal with them. But how do we get into people's lives, see them for who they are, and say, you are a human made in the image of God, and we want to be with you in this?
I love this question. And I love that you are using the verb see. Thank you. See, it's like that is gospel 101, you know? My favorite verse in all the gospels verses is the story of the cleansing of the unwell man in the temple, the synagogue, which is Mark 1:21 through 28. It's my favorite pericope because it's this idea that Jesus encounters the unwell man, the shouting man in the synagogue, and he sees him, and the man sees Jesus. And Jesus commands the unclean spirits to come out of the man, and the spirits comply. Like, that's the miracle. That's authority in word and authority in sight and seeing. And I love that because what happens with that is that because Jesus saw and healed, then the unwell man is able to participate in community worship, right? Because he is healed. And so I think for us, that's what it means for us in community as well. Secrecy and shame are bedfellows. So anytime that we can take the secrecy out of mental unwellness, we ease up on the shame. And for us as Christians, oh my goodness, we are so good at secrecy, right? We are so good at filters and making it shiny and polite, just like Revy and Between Two Trailers. But what Christianity needs is some dusting off of that, right? Really to be ourselves in community and to admit our trauma, our shame, our secrets, so that we can connect with each other, because we know that being vulnerable is like a roots down, walls down effect, right? Proximity reduces prejudice. And so as soon as we share story, which is our oral tradition, that is our tradition in Christianity, we become vulnerable and connected with one another. And that's how we see each other as Jesus sees us, right? But so many churches are unwilling to facilitate the space, right, to share that vulnerability and to eliminate that secrecy that helps ease the shame of it. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. Like, what does this look like in community for us to be honest with one another about our unwellness or our trauma in our lives? What does it look like practically, you know?
One of them, what I was thinking of while you were sharing was in James, where it says, confess your sins one to another and you will be healed.
Yes.
I think we need to help people realize what that is. It's not just the bad things that you do that are unmoral, but it's sharing the story of disconnection from God and others and relationship, and knowing that the problem with my life is that I have a disconnect either in my brain, in my relationship. I destroyed it because of something. Once I start to share my story of that disconnection, the repair can start to happen within community. The reconnection of the sin, the trauma, the disconnection can happen when we say, I see you, I hear you, and I know we can get better and we could be healed together as a community. And so it is that sharing of story one to another. It is being vulnerable and open and saying, I have a problem with that. I remember back when I was in, high school, or right out of high school, I was a part of a small group of guys, this accountability group. We had our older mentor and accountability group, and I messed up. I did some stupid things, and I then confessed it, and I said, this is what I did, and I'm just yearning for reconnection, and they shamed me and shunned me in that space, and I'm like, I thought this was a safe spot. And so because of that, it took me a long time to say, I'm comfortable with being vulnerable and sharing things in the open. So as community, we have to not only confess, but we have to receive that confession well. As you saw any community in that back part, what does it look like to receive confession well?
Ooh, oh my goodness. Well, first, I feel your shame in my body. When you recounted that story, I feel it so in my gut, and I'm holding it with you because it's painful. It's painful, right? And I think one of the things that I learned from chaplaincy is that, to be a human Tupperware container, not that we have to meet the needs of people all the time, but one of the things that we can do, I think, in community is just listen more, right? Instead of being really quick to shame or quick with a rebuttal or quick with a you should, right? You should have done this, or you should do this now. Instead, really be active listeners and holding it and being in discernment with each other, but without rushing to the judgment, right? And the evaluation. And that's hard for the church. That's really hard. My favorite three books of the Bible, we've already talked about: Job, James, and Mark. And so, and there's a lot in those three books that I think cover the ethos of Christian theology. But the important part is going all the way back to what you just said. We don't have any examples in the gospel where Jesus is shaming people, like shaming to the point of creating deep wounds that will never be healed. That is not the gospel at all. And so I do think maybe some learning needs to happen within our communities on how to hold space with love, right? With love and grace, as opposed to shame. Because shame fuels so many really painful emotions, including anger, right? And then we take that anger out in the world, and then it just, it works in perpetuity, not in a good way. And so, yeah, I think you're right. Learning how to be community and hold things without shaming others is really, really important. And our model is Christ, right? We can look to the way Jesus handles sticky predicaments and sticky people and prickly people, and see how he handles it with love and grace above all else, and forgiveness as well.
When my wife and I lived in the Middle East, we were working with Syrian refugees, so war refugees, and we were working with all sorts of people with trauma, because you escape war. I mean, I heard crazy stories of war and pain and death and all sorts of things, and these children are growing up in just this trauma-fueled environment. And so we had to very quickly figure out, okay, how do we help people with trauma and children with trauma? So in your story, and then in your life, how have you said or found that communities can help children of trauma that are growing up in trauma? What are some ways to help children grow up in a healthier way and deal with the trauma that they have been walking through as young people that has just been done to them?
Yes. So growing up, when I was, before I was 6, my church was Dr. Robert Schuller. Dr. Robert Schuller's Hour of Power, which was broadcast live from the Crystal Cathedral in Los Angeles, California. And so that was my church from 0 to 6. And then my grandparents would take me to Dana Community Bible Church, which was about 20 minutes from our trailer. But when we moved to North Carolina and I started attending church regularly, babysitters would take me to church. My mother didn't go to church much, but she made sure I was there. I began to see adults acting like adults. And what I mean by that is that they allowed children to be children, right? They created safe boundaries for children to play and explore and learn. And I think that's a really important lesson for us as church. We cannot control what is happening in a child's life at home, right? We cannot control war. We can't control violence. But if we can offer children safe space where we meet their needs in terms of providing food and safety and shelter and good, healthy boundaries and time for play, and the children get to see us being adults who are protectors and holders of safe space so that they can be children, to me, that is the gift of healing those wounds of childhood trauma in real time, is creating that safe space for children to be children.
So what would you say if there was a group of people say, I really feel like God wants us to move into a neighborhood to help the children that are going through trauma. So in your trailer park or whatever in Indiana. So if a group came in, what would be helpful for a group of people that move into the neighborhood? So they're going to be incarnational. They're not going to just fly in from the outside, but they're going to be there and be present. What would be helpful for some people there that doesn't cause more harm to the community and doesn't, have their nice little savior complex, thing? What would be helpful in a community, like moving into a community like that?
Oh my gosh, great question. And I'm so glad you added, the white savior complex, right? We don't want no part of that. And that's not what communities need. And so one thing I have learned from Diamond Harges and Mike Mather, who were out of Indianapolis. Mike Mather's in Boulder, Colorado now. But they sort of taught me this idea of asset-based community development, which is when you are a part of communities, but the main thing that you do is listen, because communities know what they need and they will tell you what they need, and you just have to do the work of listening. And so for folks who are working on asset-based community development, it would be listening to the needs of the parents, the children, the seniors in the community. And for me, in my particular setting, it was about meeting basic needs, right? So food and shelter and connection, like very basic, a pyramid of needs. And then from there, it moves up, right, to spiritual needs and belonging and community. But I think first, Mike Mather and Diamond always say, put cash in the hands of people that need it. And what they mean by that is that meet those basic needs first and be willing to listen for people to tell you what they need, because they know their community needs, even those who are unwell and maybe don't have a really firm grip on reality, they still know that they need help in some form. And so that's sort of what I would say. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, of what you've learned by working overseas and by being in community with others.
Nah, I think that's a fantastic first step. We were talking last night as a church. We're thinking about a neighborhood. We decided, as we move into a neighborhood or thinking about moving into a neighborhood, we need to do some asset-based community development. So what you said was spot on. I want to get back into your parents. I think one of the things that we often think of as people that are mentally unwell, they are destabled for all of life. But your parents both were mental health professionals in the midst of dealing with their own pain and grief. What was some of their superpowers of being that their mental illness actually helped provide them and provided people in the community? And how do they operate as mental health professionals while dealing with mental health issues themselves?
I love this question. Thank you. Thank you for highlighting that, because they did have superpowers, and their superpower was empathy. They didn't have empathy for each other, but they had empathy for everyone else. And so my parents would always take their keys out of their pocket and jingle it in front of my face and say, Budgie, the only difference between us and them is who's got the keys. And what they meant by that is that there is a fine line between those who are well and unwell, right? And those who are the oppressed and the oppressor. And so for them, they always had their antenna tuned to those whom the world had subjugated, marginalized, oppressed, broken, shamed, right? Because they knew what that felt like. They knew those wounds very deeply. And so for them, it was always moving around the world with attention to those whom the world had rejected. And so I picked up that gift as well. It was really their superpower, quite honestly. And I have the gift on an elementary school level. And so I'm just grateful, though, that I got to see it in action, because that is what made them extraordinary mental health professionals. If they could have stuck with it, right, and really dove all the way in those healthcare settings, man, the things that they could have done. But what they did do in their work as in psychiatry was significant. Their patients had really strong bonds with them. And it was even their patients who said, when they first got together, who sort of took them aside and said, this match is bound to end in combustion. And you know that when your sickest patients are telling you that, and you are their caregiver, that something is going to end in madness. But, like I said, they didn't have their antennas tuned to each other. They were not empathetic towards one another. But when it came to anything outside of themselves, oh my goodness, their empathy ran as deep as the ocean.
I think empathy is really important. I had an interesting thought and question. So your parents knew and understood mental health really well, but they still succumbed to the badness. I think we are the most trauma-informed generation ever, and we're dealing with extreme high levels of anxiety and depression. I wonder what the link to understanding and mental health is. And is there something that we need to move, that we do need understanding, but maybe we need to move into something maybe more practice? I don't know what it is, but what is that role of understanding and then moving into something else so that we can help one another in our mental health issues?
Yeah, making that shift. I hear what you're saying, and I want to hear your ideas on this too, because I do think, we are, like you said, we are more aware of mental health than any generation before us, right? We talk about it. We talk about trauma. We talk about it in church. But the issue, right, is still a lack of resources. Quite frankly, we don't have enough practitioners. We don't have enough certified counselors and social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists to meet the needs of people, and talk therapists, all of that. And so I think the church is a good community to work on small group settings, right? Also, a lot of churches host NA meetings, AA meetings to help folks cope and recover in addictions. The church should always open its doors to small groups who are working on healing. And so I think those are the things that we need to do more on a micro level, as we try to fill in the gaps of certified practitioners to help on the really evidence-based practices and modalities, but those aren't available in every community. And so, but the church is, that's one of the things. This book started as a research project funded by the Louisville Institute. It was first a podcast before it was a book, but the driving question of Between Two Trailers was, there's a church on every corner in every town in America. Why aren't we leveraging that, right, as community centers, as hubs for learning, as hubs for healing and recovery, when that is something that is present in every single community? A house of worship, right, a faith-based place can be found in every single community. So therefore, what is the church's or the faith-based organization's role in promoting healing by meeting the needs with, like what we said before, basic needs, but also sort of those higher level psychological needs? We don't expect churches and pastors to be, social workers and counselors. That's not the expectation. But the idea is you've got buildings and lights and food, and places where people can gather to have open conversations, safe ones. And so that's what I think has to happen on a practical level, is more small group and more availability for people to gather and talk.
Well, I think those are fantastic ideas to help us practically get into the weeds of people, and to help work out community. Part of what our mental health and the awareness of mental health does for me is help us look inward into ourselves. I think one of the superpower of your parents, one of the things that I love about Jesus is he helps me lift my eyes, not only to look to God, but look to the margins and the marginalized, the neglected, other people. What's the role of looking at others, having empathy, seeing other people in our relationship to mental health?
Yes. Okay. So I think when we are truly able to see other people as they are, there's a level of acceptance, right, that lets people be who they are. Like going back full circle to my Between Two Trailers childhood, I couldn't really be who I was meant to be in those years, right? There was no room for me to forge my own identity as Budgie. But if I had had some better tools, right, or some different tools, it may have been a very different story and outcome. But I do think, the ability to see people as they are, and going all the way back to Mark 1:21 through 28, to provide some resources for healing so that people can be whole people in community, because mental health symptoms are not indicative of the whole person. And I think that's one thing everyone in church, everyone who is a neighbor, who is community, needs to remember. When you see a symptom of mental health, you see a behavior, you see an addiction, it is not indicative of who that person is in their wholeness and in their fullness.
Yeah, that's really good. Dana, if you could tell your readers what you would hope that they would get from your book, what do you hope your readers would get?
Joshua, we've been talking a lot about the verb see, right? It's a very biblical verb. And so my hope is that people see themselves in this story. The details are different. I don't expect everyone to have been a preschool drug dealer, right? It's sort of a way to get you in and get you reading, right? But I do hope it offers a map to the interior, to exactly what you were just talking about, a map into asking some tough questions about home and family, and what are the spaces in our life when we have felt pulled between two things, two cultures, two religions, two people, where we felt like a midfielder, right? And so I hope the book will it'll be entertaining, right? It'll inform people, but more importantly, I hope it will offer them a map to their own interior, to consider the ways, family is complicated, people are complicated, but if we can sort of paraphrase Jesus, blessed are the complicated hearts. And so I hope this book is a map for folks to begin exploring that.
So good. If you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh my goodness. Don't fret. Don't fret. It's going to work out. It is all going to be fine. And you are doing the best you can with the tools you have right now.
That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Oh my goodness. My new addiction is baseball. I love baseball. It's something my father and I used to talk on Sunday nights, and he would have a baseball game playing in the background. And so it's always soothing for me right now. And so we're in primetime baseball season. So baseball is always on in my house. And so I urge people to find something that is that sort of Sabbath for them, right? And if it can come from something, if it can replace some other media or something that keeps us frenetic, but instead invites us to a deep breath, invites us to walk with Jesus, invites us to turn inward, whatever it is, may we be invited to do so. And right now, in this moment, it's baseball for me.
Well, baseball does that. And it is amazing to just slow down. And I know they've tried to speed the game up, and it is more entertaining on TV, but it is nice to say, hey, I'm going to take 3 hours and we're going to watch a baseball game.
Joshua, you get it. You understand me completely. Yes.
It is good. It is good. And, I just have to say, go Mariners.
Look at you. Okay.
I'm a big Mariners fan. So
good. I'll think of you every time they're playing. I watch all the games. I don't discriminate. I'm a Yankees girl, but I watch all games. So when I see the Mariners,
I do discriminate against the Yankees, but
I understand. As a Mariners, yes, I understand completely. But I will now think of you each time I watch a game. So thanks for that.
Yes, that's good. So Dana, how can people go out and get your book, Between Two Trailers? How could they connect with you? Where would you like to point people to?
Please come find me. I love connecting with folks. I'm at Dana Trent on all socials, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X. And you can find the book Between Two Trailers, a memoir, anywhere you love to buy books. It's in Kindle form, it's an audiobook, it's in hardcover. And so get it from your favorite retailer, indie or chain, whatever feels good, and recommend it. Recommend it to your libraries so that folks have access for free, to this story and to these resources. That's really important to me as well. But yes, connect with me online at Dana Trent.
Right. Well, I hope everybody gets this book, Between Two Trailers, and I hope we make it the memoir of the summer, that it just starts to go and people hand it out and want to read it because it's fantastic. Thank you, Dana, for sharing your story, for opening yourself up to dealing with your own wounds and trauma of childhood, to discovering who you are as you're walking through life. Thank you for just grabbing some more tools so that you could ground yourself into different spiritual practices and life, so that you can be healed and healthy to move forward in a wonderful way. And thank you for allowing us to find ourselves within your story, and so that we can help people with mental illness or that are mentally unwell. And if we're dealing with some of those things, to say, hey, others see me as well, that I'm not isolated, I'm not alone. There are people that could journey with me as I am struggling. So thank you for this. It was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you, and hopefully I have you on again. We can talk about world religions and different things that you're wrestling with and dealing with as a teacher,
Please
which
do.
would be fun.
That'd be amazing.
Thanks, Dana.
Oh, thanks you so much, Joshua. Peace and blessings to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.